Welcome to RealClear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We close out the year revisiting two of our favorite subjects, regulatory overreach in the administrative state and the politicization of science. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Peter Wallison from the American Enterprise Institute, who'll dissect the disaster known as Dodd-Frank. Up first, we're pleased to welcome John Tierney back to the program, contributing editor for the City Journal, 2014 Julian Simon Award winner, and science columnist for the New York Times. John, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be back.
John, I asked you on because an article you published recently titled The Real War on Science laid out some issues we've been struggling with here on the program, so I thought the subject would be a great way to wrap up the year. You open your piece defending your inclination to devote more of your science writing to sins of the left rather than sins of the right, because you state that the right has very little impact on science. Explain.
Well, people always talk about Republicans being anti-science, and they point to creationism. They point to a few things like the ban on federal funding for embryonic stem cell research. But these things have had very little impact on science itself. And if you look at actually what affects science, what research gets done, what gets published, what taboos exist, they're almost exclusively from the left. Most scientists tend to lean left, and they're much more subject to pressure from that side than they are to the right.
Well, you identify two huge threats to science. These are confirmation bias and the fatal conceit. Let's take each one in turn. What is confirmation bias, and how is it manifested in science and science policy?
Well, confirmation bias is a tendency of all of us to seek out and to believe information that confirms our own existing biases. And everyone is subject to this, and scientists try to avoid this by having outside peer review. People who disagree with you read your work and they spot your biases. The problem in the social sciences is that they've just become basically a monoculture. The ratio of social science is at least 8-1, Democrats to Republicans, and in some fields it's like 40-1. So there really aren't conservatives anymore in social science. And once you get people together, one academic department or one discipline that becomes dominated by one side, the more they talk to each other, they just reinforce each other's beliefs and prejudices, and they become more extreme. They start to think that their opinions are not just accurate, but they think it's the truth. And anyone who disagrees must be unscientific or wrong.
Well, confirmation bias is not just restricted to the social sciences. It occurs just about everywhere.
Right, it does. I mean, it's especially bad in the social sciences, I think, because in physics, when you study something, particles don't have party affiliations. But when you're studying people's attitudes, there's been a whole body of research about how conservatives tend to be more dogmatic and more prejudiced and more irrational and more selfish than liberals are. A few social scientists have noticed recently that, and there's a very influential paper published last year, noting that a lot of this research is very biased because of the way they ask questions. They would ask people how strongly they felt about certain religious beliefs, and conservatives would be more strongly clung to those beliefs. And they concluded, therefore, that they're basically just inherently more dogmatic. And finally, someone came along and said, well, suppose we ask some questions that matter more to liberals, like how they feel about the environment or how they feel about Barack Obama. And on those things, liberals were just as dogmatic and irrational as conservatives were. There are all these taboos basically from this confirmation bias that affects the questions that they ask, the questions that you think are important, income inequality or racial discrimination. These receive such overwhelming importance in the social sciences now because those are mainly concerns of the left, whereas other concerns of the right, don't even get addressed at all.
Given the way peer review is structured in the publishing business, how does this groupthink you mentioned create barriers to the emergence of new ideas while limiting the ability to challenge so-called settled science, even in the hard sciences?
There was a classic study where they showed 75 different psychologists a paper to be reviewed. They were acting as referees for a paper, and there's a paper about the mental health of student activists, left-wing student activists. And in one version of the paper, the student activist health was below normal. And then they manipulated the data and showed another version of the paper to other people. And what they found was that the referees were much more likely to accept the paper, to think the methodology was great, if it said good things about the left-wing student activists. And suddenly, and it's easy to question the methodology of any paper. You can always say, well, they should have done this, they should have done that. And when you have everyone sits on one side of the ideological fence and they're not letting through things that don't jive with their own confirmation biases. And that has a big impact on what gets published, and it has a big impact on what gets studied, because people realize if I study this thing, even if I come up with some interesting results, if this contradicts the prevailing conventional wisdom, people are going to find problems with it and not want to publish it. You ask also about the hard sciences, and the same thing kind of happens there. I mean, right now, and we can talk more about this later, about environmental science, research that questions any of the dogma about how serious global warming is and how rapidly it's happening, that is research that is less likely to get published or funded.
Well, John, what role do taboos play in science, and what happens to scientists who dare to break them?
John Haidt from NYU, who's written a book called The Righteous Mind, studies a lot about how people have strong moral beliefs. And one of his basic points is that we think that we reach these rational feelings about our philosophy by logic, but in fact a lot of it comes from these sort of gut feelings people have about what constitutes fairness or what constitutes other virtues. And people form their own, what he calls moral tribal communities that have their own values, their sacred values. And right now for the left, those values are anti-racism, fairness meaning income equality. And so these are really sacred values. And anyone who challenges that, it becomes taboo. And there are terrible examples in the past 40 years of subjects that just became taboo because they violated those values.
Well, let's look at one of them. When it comes to unraveling the mysteries of human biology and psychology, why is the left so heavily invested in the blank slate dogma, which you call a liberal version of creationism?
Right. It's this idea that there hasn't been any evolution in humans since we left Africa about 50,000 years ago. It's anathema to the left to think there are any important racial differences. And part of the blank slate dogma is that any differences between groups are due to discrimination than to other cultural factors, not to biology. And that includes differences between men and women. The left is just obsessed with discrimination and with protecting victims of discrimination. And the fear has always been that if we say there are any biological differences, that will be used to justify discrimination, that will be used to justify different outcomes among groups. The result has been that the left is just denying all this biological evidence that has come up. There's been a genetic revolution. We've been unraveling DNA and seeing the differences. We've been using neuroscience to look inside the brains of men and women. We see these huge biological differences. We see genetic differences. And yet the left's attitude is basically, no biology, please, we're social scientists. And so any difference between men and women has to be blamed on culture or discrimination, not on biology.
Well, when it comes to public perceptions, why is the mainstream media so heavily invested in painting conservatives as anti-science?
It's become an unfortunate part of the left now, this sort of Saul Alinsky tactic of kind of demonizing the opposition and personalizing it. It's this sneer and smear technique of basically that these people are so biased or they're so irrational or they're so stupid that it's not even worth arguing with them. It's an effective political tool to say that these people aren't even fit to debate. It makes it easier to debate that way, and it makes them feel good. I mean, Democrats call themselves the party of science. They're in favor of science. And it's an effective debating tool, but it's terrible for science. I mean, science is all about constantly testing hypotheses, constantly challenging conventional wisdom. But instead what's happened is we have these, beliefs that must be respected, and we can't even do research into them. So, research, for instance, about the impact of single-parent households. Daniel Patrick Moynihan pointed out in the 1960s, this is a major problem for young black children. And that was so taboo to say that it was blaming the victim. So that became taboo for decades until finally the data was just so overwhelming that, yes, growing up in a single-parent household was a big risk for kids.
John, we've been talking about the two biggest threats to science coming from the left that you identify in your article, The Real War on Science. We discussed the first, which is confirmation bias. The second is the left's long tradition of mixing science and politics, resulting in master plans to redesign society. Hayek calls this the fatal conceit. Give us some general historical background on that.
Well, the fatal conceit, as Hayek said, is the delusion that experts know enough to redesign society. And this has been a big part of leftist ideology since Marx had this idea of scientific socialism. It was a big part of progressivism, that there was this vision that we'll have this better future from expert social engineers who will remake society and abolish all these irrational things. And what Hayek realized was that nobody has enough information to be a central planner, that it fails because nobody knows enough to be able to run everything. But the left has had this vision that we're going to make things better and redesign things, and we're going to do it scientifically. And that has always had a big appeal for scientists because it turns them into these high priests. That we're going to use you to tell us how to redesign society, and there's suddenly this big role for you in telling us what has to be done because you're the experts. So there's always been this temptation for scientists to exaggerate their expertise and their moral authority and say, yes, we know what the right thing to do is, and you must follow our orders.
Well, speaking of following orders, what did we learn from the Soviet Union's attempt to practice scientific socialism and design the new Soviet man?
Well, they had this idea that we're going to redesign society from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, and we will build new people who will work happily in this new society. And what they found was that for all their efforts, for all the propaganda they did and all their theories, people remained people, that people remained selfish. They cared more about their own families than they did about serving the greater common good. And basically people did not work hard, and the economy was terrible because they couldn't transform people's basic urges. People naturally want to work harder for their own good and for their family's good, than they do to give their money to some greater social good. And that's why the Soviet economy never worked. And today we have these equivalents of this where, feminism has this idea that, the hardcore feminism has been that there aren't significant differences between men and women, that the differences that we see are all due to culture and to patriarchy's oppressive rule and to discrimination. And therefore we should expect to find the same number of men and women in different occupations. We should find them at the same levels at these things, doing the same kind of things. So they reject all the evidence, and you can see this not only in humans, you see it in primates, you see it by looking at the different brain structures, you see it in children, that boys and girls behave differently. They're interested in different things on average. Obviously,
Sure.
there are girls who love being engineers, but there are more boys who like being engineers. And this effort to try to ensure that, that we have equal numbers of people in each one, it's a bit like that Soviet thing. And it's been 50 years now, and it hasn't worked, and it won't work.
The progressives have a lot to answer for their promotion of eugenics, which eventually led to the Nazi horrors. Has the left gotten over its interest in controlling human breeding?
It's awful because the left was behind the eugenics movement, this idea that we're going to scientifically breed a smarter society. And the horrors of Nazi Germany made the left reject that aspect of it. And they've actually managed to classify Nazism as a right-wing, a movement, when in fact it was a big government movement. It was right-wing only by comparison with communism. And they do have this horror about picking on minority groups the way the Nazis did, but they transferred this idea into controlling breeding of population. The whole idea of the population bomb, and that we have overpopulation, as if that was some scientifically designed thing. The late Bill Tucker was a great writer, had a line. He said, there have always been two forms of demagoguery that work. One is to tell poor people that rich people have too much money. The other is to tell rich people that there are too many poor people. It certainly appealed to kind of the landed gentry, the idea of the horror of all these poor people throughout the world breeding, and they were going to overrun us. So it had a certain kind of appeal to the gentry there. And it had a certain appeal on the left, too. China adopted this because it fits into this idea that the state has to control everything, and we must control the size of the population. We can't let people decide on their own to do that. And so the population crisis in the U.S., there were great promoters of it, like John Holdren, who is now President Obama's science advisor. But in the U.S., there was talk that we should limit people's ability to have children here, but of course people just were not going to stand for it. But these ideas from the left here in the West, they moved to China, and China had this really monstrous one-child population program where they're They pressured people to have only one child. There were forced abortions. There was female infanticide. And China now has this big problem where they have a lot of old people and not many young people to take care of them. It's a classic example of the perils of central planning. These experts did not know what they were talking about.
John, you mentioned Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, ruling in the name of the party of science. He's got quite a colorful background, doesn't he?
John Holdren is a guy who has risen to be the White House science advisor. He was head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was head of Woods Hole. He has risen to all these places despite being wrong about everything throughout his career. He allied with Paul Ehrlich early on, and they wrote these books arguing that the world was terribly overpopulated, making these ridiculous predictions about mass die-offs and mass that we're running out of food, we're running out of natural resources. They wrote books, arguing that it would be constitutional in the United States to limit people's right to breed. They discussed very calmly and really creepily ways you could do mass sterilization by putting sterilants in drinking water, by doing other things. And they were completely wrong about this stuff. And then Ehrlich went on to talk about that we're running out of fossil fuels. We have to limit them. He and Ehrlich had this idea there should be a great planetary regime that would control natural resources throughout the world. It would control population growth. He also made this bet with Julian Simon where, Julian Simon said, if you think we're running out of natural resources, pick something and I'll bet you that it'll be cheaper in the future. And Holdren and Ehrlich took him up on it. They picked 5 metals and they lost on all 5 of them. And yet all these mistakes, it just doesn't seem to matter. He kept getting honors and kept getting promoted because he's saying this conventional wisdom that appeals very much to the left. He always had these ideas that there's some crisis up ahead that requires the expansion of state power and gives more power to people like John Holdren.
Well, speaking of the biggest crisis that's been held out justifying the expansion of state power, no science has become more politicized than environmental science. What's been the impact of the sneer and smear techniques you mentioned used to demonize anyone who questions global warming hysteria?
It has really silenced debate, and there's a long-sad history of this. In the Peace and City Journal, I give one example of in the war about dietary fat. There was this idea that this conviction that a few activists had that dietary fat was causing obesity and heart disease and all these problems. And there were dissenters from the start, but they were written off as, they're just flacks for the food industry. They were demonized and accused of taking money, and they were just basically silenced. And it took, decades for the research to come out and show actually they were right. And we're seeing the same sort of thing going on with climate science now, where the few skeptics who point out that, well, yes, the greenhouse effect is real, and yes, the world's warming, but we don't really know how much it's going to warm. We don't know how dangerous it's going to be, and we certainly don't know the best way to deal with it. There are lots of different ways you can deal with this thing. But anyone who doesn't accept the green dogma that it's a crisis, that we must start reducing greenhouse emissions right now, is labeled a denier. I mean, President Obama says it. There are scientists who say it. And they're accused, of course, of being flacks for industry. And the strange thing about this is that the money is all on the other side. There's less than $20 million a year is spent by the vast right-wing conspiracy at these think tanks funding people who are skeptics. There's more than $10 billion on the other side in money from governments, from the big green groups. There's so much more money on the other side, so much more incentive to say something's a crisis, because the more that you yell it's a crisis, the more incentive there is to get money for it. But the effect has been that scientists' careers are jeopardized if they dare speak out about this. This overwhelming pressure from the media, from left-wing activists, from funding agencies, and from activist scientists to toe the party line and say, yes, we know everything there is to know about climate science. We know exactly what we have to do, and we have to follow this political agenda.
Has all this politicization of environmentalism caused the public to lose trust in scientists the way they've lost trust in politicians and journalists?
Yes, very much. People often say that the American public is so uninformed because a large percentage of them don't believe in global warming. And I think what those polls are really measuring is people may accept the idea that, yes, that there's a greenhouse effect and, yes, that the world has gotten warmer. But what they don't accept is what's conflated with that, this whole idea that, therefore, we must follow the green agenda and start building all these windmills and start doing solar panels and start doing all this other stuff that, in fact, probably won't do very much good at all. So I think people are they're naturally suspicious. I mean, it's often some of the same people who told us that we'd all be starving by now because of the population crisis. They told us that we'd now be freezing in the dark because we're running out of fossil fuels. They told us there'd be a cancer epidemic from all the synthetic chemicals around. None of these things happened. None of these apocalypses came. So why believe these people again? Now, I happen to think that climate change, it's a genuine threat. I mean, we don't know how bad it's going to be. It might end up being beneficial. I think probably there'll be something that'll be relatively easy to deal with in the future when we're richer. But it's a genuine threat. But it has been hyped so much that, so that people get cast in this camp that if you don't believe it's the world's greatest problem that must be addressed now, then you're a denier and you're cast out of respectable society.
John, what advice do you have for a new president when it comes to restoring scientific integrity to public policy?
Well, the great thing about Trump, I think, is that he has shown fairly little interest in science. I think that's a good thing because Obama was very interested in science in the wrong way. He wanted to use it to advance his agenda. And you had his appointees, his science advisor, John Holdren, you had his appointees at the agencies using science and often using junk science or questionable science to justify their attempts to expand the power of the federal government. And that really politicized science. It's made people, social scientists right now in Washington are considered, I think, by Republicans as an arm of the Democratic Party. They're almost all liberal. Their research so much tends to be aimed at supporting liberal programs and policies that they're just not taken seriously. The hard scientists are still taken seriously, but I think that the emphasis on the climate religion is a threat to them. And if it turns out that, global warming has been hyped too much, then their reputation is going to sink. So my advice to Trump is basically let scientists follow the data instead of biases. Try and get in people who are skeptics of everything. You need people who will challenge conventional wisdom, who will challenge taboos. You need a mix of opinions in there. You need left and right. You need people from different points of view. And you need people who don't have an agenda of, we have to come up with findings that justify the expansion of the state.
Well, John, let's hope the new president takes your advice. Thanks for coming on the show to share your views.
Thank you, Bill.
That was John Tierney, contributing editor for the City Journal, here on RealClear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. RealClear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with RealClear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, a donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. Ahead, we'll speak with Peter Wallison from the American Enterprise Institute, who digs into the Dodd-Frank regulatory fiasco and how to fix it.